The words hang in the morning air like frost. By order of King Edward, all wages are hereby returned to their levels of 1346. Any worker found demanding higher payment will face the stocks, branding, or worse. The commissioner's voice carries the authority of the crown, but his eyes betray uncertainty. Even royal authority feels different in this changed world. You stand in Lord Edmund's great hall, feeling the weight of history pressing down on your shoulders. The tapestries on the walls seem to watch, silent witnesses to a conversation that would reshape the future of England. Your hands, rough from years of honest labor, clench and unclench at your sides. Lord Edmund clears his throat, the sound echoing in the vast space. "Thomas," he says, his voice carefully measured, "we must comply with the king's law. Your wages will return to 2 shillings per week, as they were before the great mortality." The words taste bitter in his mouth because he knows what you know. 2 shillings won't keep his fields planted or his grain harvested. The younger commissioner steps forward, his polished boots clicking against the stone floor. Furthermore, any attempt to seek employment elsewhere at higher wages is forbidden. Workers must remain in their home parishes and accept the wages offered by their rightful lords. His hand rests casually on his sword hilt, a gesture meant to intimidate. But something has changed in the 35 years since the plague swept through England like God's own scythe. You've tasted freedom, earned decent wages, slept in a real bed, owned property. These things change a person, change them in ways that can't be unchanged by royal decree. "Begging your pardon, my lord," you say, your voice steady despite the hammering of your heart. But the fields won't plough themselves. The wheat won't plant itself. And come harvest time, the grain won't cut itself. The commissioners exchange glances. This isn't the meek acceptance they expected. Lord Edmund's face flushes red above his beard. "You forget yourself, Thomas. These gentlemen represent the king's will." But even as he speaks the words, you can see the desperation in his eyes. Behind the bluster and the royal authority, he knows the mathematics of survival. Too few workers, too much land, too much work to be done. With all respect to His Majesty, you continue, stepping forward slightly. The king doesn't need his fields harvested to keep from starving. You do. The words hang in the air like a challenge thrown down at a tournament. The older commissioner, a man with grey threading through his beard, shifts uncomfortably. That evening, as darkness settles over Little Wickham like a familiar blanket, you sit by your fire thinking about the day's events. The flames dance and flicker, casting shadows that seem to move with lives of their own. Outside, you can hear the sound of voices, low and urgent. Other peasants, other workers, gathering to discuss what they've heard. Margaret appears at your door just after full dark, her face grave in the firelight. "They came to see me too," she says without preamble. "Told me I couldn't run my husband's business anymore. Said it wasn't proper for a woman to engage in commerce without male supervision." Her voice carries an edge you've never heard before, sharp as a blade fresh from the smith's hammer. You pour her some ale from the jug on your table, good ale that you can afford because of the wages you've been earning. "What did you tell them?" She sits down across from you, her hands wrapped around the cup for warmth. "I told them they could supervise me all they wanted, but my customers don't pay their bills to the king's commissioners." Over the next few days, the commissioners make their rounds through the village and the surrounding countryside. They speak to every worker, every merchant, every person who has benefited from the strange new economics of post-plague England. Their message is always the same. Return to the old ways. Accept the old wages. Know your place. But knowing your place becomes complicated when your place has changed. When you've seen what life can be like with decent wages and reasonable working conditions. When you've tasted the possibility of something better than mere survival. The resistance begins quietly, the way most revolutions do. Workers simply don't show up at the old wages. Merchants find reasons why they can't sell their goods at pre-plague prices. Widows continue running businesses they're now forbidden to operate. It's not organized rebellion, not yet. It's something more dangerous than that. It's the quiet refusal of people who have discovered their own worth. Lord Edmund finds himself in an impossible position. The royal commissioners expect him to enforce the new laws, but his fields need tending and his manor needs maintaining. When you don't show up for work at 2 shillings a week, he has no one to replace you. The same mathematics that gave you power before the commissioners arrived still apply after they leave. 3 weeks after the commissioners' visit, Lord Edmund's steward appears at your door again. But this time, there's no summons to the Great Hall, no royal authority behind his words. Just a tired man with an offer. His lordship wondered if you might consider returning to work. For 3 shillings a week. Paid quietly, you understand. No need to mention it to any traveling officials. You pretend to consider the offer, though you've already decided. The power dynamic has shifted too far to go back now. 4 shillings, you say, and I keep my Sundays free. And if any more commissioners come around asking questions, I've never met you before in my life. The steward nods, too quickly. It's not just acceptance, it's relief. That night, you lie in bed listening to the sounds of the village settling into sleep. Fewer sounds than there used to be, but somehow more meaningful. Each light in each window represents a person who survived, who endured, who refused to go back to the way things were just because a king in London decided they should. The royal commissioners leave Little Wickham the next morning, their mission technically complete. They've delivered the king's message, spoken to all the workers, made the royal will known. What they haven't done is change anything that matters. The fundamental equation remains the same. Too much work, too few people, too many opportunities for those clever enough to seize them. As their horses disappear down the muddy road toward the next village, you return to your fields. The winter wheat needs attention, and there's ground to prepare for spring planting. The work is the same as it was before the commissioners came, but somehow it feels different. Each furrow you plow is an act of quiet rebellion. Each seed you plant a declaration of independence. Because that's what you've learned in the years since the Great Mortality. Authority that can't enforce itself isn't really authority at all. Laws that ignore reality don't change reality. They just make themselves irrelevant. And power, real power, belongs to the people who do the work that keeps the world running. The sun sets on Little Wickham, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that remind you of the tapestries in Lord Edmund's hall. But unlike those ancient hangings, this beauty belongs to everyone. The sunset doesn't care about royal decrees or wage laws or the proper order of society. It simply is, magnificent and free, like the new world being born from the ashes of the old. Margaret's shop stands at the corner of what used to be the busiest street in Little Wickham. Before the plague, merchants would arrive daily with carts full of goods from distant towns. Spices from London, wool from the northern counties, iron tools from the smiths of Birmingham. Now the street sees maybe 1 cart a week, but somehow Margaret's business thrives in ways her husband never imagined possible. You push open the heavy wooden door, breathing in the rich scents of cinnamon and cloves that somehow Margaret still manages to acquire. The interior is larger than you remember, expanded into the space that used to house the cooper's workshop. No one needs as many barrels when there's less grain to store, less ale to brew, fewer people to serve. Margaret looks up from her ledger, ink stains on her fingers and satisfaction in her eyes. Thomas, perfect timing. I've got something to show you. She leads you to the back of the shop, where bolts of cloth catch the afternoon light streaming through new windows. Glass windows, not the oiled paper or wooden shutters that most shops make do with. This cloth comes from Flanders, she explains, running her hand over fabric so fine it seems to shimmer. The weaver there lost half his customers to the plague. Now he's willing to trade directly with merchants like me, cut out the middlemen in London entirely. Before the mortality, someone like me could never have afforded to deal directly with Flemish weavers. The mathematics of Margaret's success are brutal but undeniable. When half the merchants die, the surviving ones inherit their customers, their trade routes, their connections. When half the customers die, the ones with money to spend become infinitely more valuable. Supply chains that once flowed through dozens of intermediaries now connect directly between producer and seller. She shows you her latest acquisition, a set of scales precise enough to weigh precious metals. I'm thinking of expanding into money changing, she says casually, as if such a thing were normal. The Italian banker who used to serve this region died 3 years ago. His sons have no interest in traveling to small villages like ours. But people still need to convert coins, especially with all the foreign traders coming through. Foreign traders represent another change the plague brought to England's economic landscape. With so many traditional trade routes disrupted, merchants from Normandy, Flanders, even as far away as the German principalities, now venture into territories they once ignored. Small villages that barely appeared on maps have become worth the journey when they're the only places still producing certain goods. Margaret's ledger tells the story of this transformation in neat columns of numbers. Income that would have seemed impossible for a village merchant just a decade ago. Profits that rival what the great trading houses of London used to earn. But more than that, it tells the story of a woman building something entirely new from the ruins of the old world. "I'm hiring another assistant," she mentions as you examine a collection of silver pins that definitely didn't come from any English workshop. Young William from the next village over. His father was a goldsmith before the plague, taught the boy something about metalwork before he died. These days, you take skills wherever you find them. The plague scattered knowledge like seeds on the wind. Apprentices whose masters died, sons whose fathers couldn't complete their training, daughters who learned trades by necessity rather than tradition. Margaret has become a collector of these orphan skills, gathering them under her roof and putting them to work in ways the old guild system never would have permitted. William arrives as if summoned by your conversation. A thin young man with the careful eyes of someone who learned early that the world could change without warning. He carries a small wooden case that he opens to reveal delicate silver work, spoons and cups decorated with patterns that speak of training far above his station. "My father served the Earl of Huntingdon before the mortality," William explains. "When the Earl's household died, my father brought his tools home and tried to make a living in our village. He taught me what he could before the fever took him last winter. Now I make what I can and hope someone will buy it." Margaret examines his work with the eye of someone who has learned to recognize quality regardless of its source. "This is beautiful work, William. I can sell pieces like this to merchants heading for London. Maybe even get them to nobles' houses that still have money to spend. Would you be interested in working here, making pieces to my specifications?" The arrangement they negotiate would have been impossible under the old guild system. William, barely trained by formal standards, working directly for a merchant woman who has no official standing in any craft organization. But the old guilds lost their power along with their members. When there aren't enough properly trained craftsmen to go around, you make do with what you have and hope it's good enough. As evening approaches, Margaret walks with you through the village, pointing out changes that speak to the quiet revolution transforming English commerce. The building that used to house the official market has been converted into workshops where people make goods for Margaret to sell. The old tax collector's house now serves as a warehouse for goods traveling between villages. Most telling of all, people with money actually have choices about how to spend it. Before the plague, a peasant with 2 extra shillings might buy bread if he was hungry or cloth if he was cold. Now, with higher wages and more opportunities, people buy things they want rather than just what they need. Luxury goods, decorative items, better versions of everyday tools. "I sold a set of silver spoons to a ploughman last week," Margaret mentions as you pass the field where that same ploughman works land that once belonged to 3 different families. He paid more for those spoons than his grandfather earned in a year. Not because he needed silver spoons, but because he wanted them. Because he could afford them. Because he wanted to own something beautiful. The transformation extends beyond individual purchases to the very structure of commerce itself. Without enough population to support the old system of regional markets and traveling merchants, trade has become more direct, more personal, more efficient in some ways. Margaret knows every customer, understands their needs, can predict what they'll want before they know it themselves. This personal touch gives her advantages that the great merchant houses of London, with their distant managers and standardized goods, simply cannot match. When the Bishop of Winchester wants altar cloths made to specific requirements, he deals directly with Margaret rather than sending orders through layers of intermediaries who might not understand exactly what he needs. Back in her shop, Margaret shows you her plans for expansion. Detailed drawings of additions to the building, new workshops, storage areas for goods that will arrive from increasingly distant sources. "I'm thinking of sending William to Flanders next spring," she says. Let him see how they make their best cloth. Maybe establish direct relationships with weavers there. The idea of a village merchant sending representatives to foreign countries would have been laughable before the plague. Now it represents the natural evolution of a commerce system that has had to reinvent itself from the ground up. Traditional hierarchies matter less than practical relationships. Official credentials matter less than the ability to deliver quality goods at fair prices. As you prepare to leave, Margaret hands you a small wrapped package. For your table, she says with a smile. Something to remind you that life isn't just about survival anymore. Inside, you find a pewter cup decorated with intricate patterns, beautiful enough to grace a lord's table but sized for ordinary hands. Walking home through the quiet streets of Little Wickham, you think about the cup in your hands and what it represents. Not just Margaret's success as a merchant, but the success of an entire economic system that has learned to function without the old constraints of guild regulations, noble privileges, and rigid social hierarchies. The plague took away the world where a peasant knew his place, a merchant served his betters, and a woman inherited property only to hold it for the next male in line. What it left behind was a world where success comes to those clever enough and determined enough to seize the opportunities hidden in catastrophe's wake. In your house, you place the pewter cup on your table next to the good bread and decent ale that represent your own rise in the world. Tomorrow, you'll return to your fields, Margaret will open her shop, William will craft his silver work, and Lord Edmund will continue pretending he has the same authority he wielded before half his subjects died. But tonight, you drink from a cup that represents possibility itself. The possibility that the world can change, that people can rise, that the future might be better than the past. It's a dangerous thought, the kind that starts revolutions and topples kingdoms. But it's also a hopeful thought, and hope, you've learned, is worth more than all the silver in Margaret's shop. Lord Edmund's manor house looks smaller in the grey morning light, as if the building itself has begun to shrink under the weight of changed circumstances. Once, this stone fortress dominated the landscape for miles around, a symbol of unquestioned authority and permanent power. Now it feels more like an expensive burden, too large for its reduced household, too costly for its diminished income. You approach the main gate for what has become a weekly negotiation, though neither of you calls it that. Officially, Lord Edmund summons you to discuss work assignments and village matters. In reality, he pleads with you to keep his estate functioning while maintaining the pretense that he still controls the arrangement. The great hall echoes with emptiness when you enter. Tapestries hang dusty and moth-eaten on walls that once displayed the wealth of generations. The long tables where dozens of retainers once shared meals now serve as storage for account books and correspondence with other lords facing similar difficulties. Even the hunting hounds are gone, sold off because feeding them became an expense Lord Edmund could no longer justify. Richard the steward meets you at the entrance, his face bearing the perpetual exhaustion of a man trying to do the work of 5 people. His ledgers tell a story of steady decline. Rents uncollected because there are no tenants to pay them. Fields lying fallow because there are no workers to plant them. Buildings falling into disrepair because there are no craftsmen to maintain them. Thomas, Richard says, leading you toward Lord Edmund's private chambers. His lordship has received correspondence from the royal court. There's to be a new tax levied to support the king's wars in France. The amount demanded would have been manageable when the estate had 200 tenants. With barely 60 people left, it represents a sum that might as well be £1 million. Lord Edmund waits in what used to be called the solar, though the fine glass windows now have cracks that let in more cold than light. He's wearing clothes that are obviously expensive but equally obviously old, maintained and remaintained until the fabric shows the stress of too many mendings. His breakfast consists of bread and ale, the same food his peasants eat. Thomas, he says, attempting to maintain the formal tone that once marked interactions between lord and peasant, I find myself in need of your counsel. The words hang in the air like an admission of defeat. Lords don't ask peasants for counsel. But then again, peasants don't usually understand estate management, tax law, and agricultural planning the way circumstances have forced you to learn. The problem, as Lord Edmund explains it, is simple mathematics rendered impossible by social reality. He needs income to maintain his position, pay royal taxes, and keep the manor functioning. But income requires tenants, and tenants require incentives to stay rather than seeking better opportunities elsewhere. The incentives he can afford to offer would bankrupt him. The taxes he must pay exceed the income he can reasonably generate. You study the papers scattered across his table, documents that reveal the desperate correspondence between nobles facing identical crises throughout England. Letters from Lord William of Gloucester, explaining how he's sold family lands to Italian merchants. Notes from the Earl of Derby, describing his decision to rent manor houses to wealthy merchants rather than trying to maintain them as noble residences. Some lords have chosen more drastic measures. The correspondence includes a letter from Sir Geoffrey of Northumberland, announcing his decision to abandon his hereditary lands entirely and seek fortune as a mercenary in the French wars. Better to die with a sword in hand, he writes, than to slowly starve while maintaining the pretense of noble dignity. Lord Edmund's situation is complicated by his sense of responsibility to the people who remain in Little Wickham. Unlike some nobles who have simply walked away from their obligations, he feels bound to maintain what order he can, provide what protection he's able, preserve what community survives in his diminished domain. What would you do, Thomas, he asks finally, abandoning all pretense of social hierarchy, if you were in my position? The question represents a complete reversal of the traditional order. For centuries, lords commanded and peasants obeyed. Now a lord asks a peasant for advice on matters that will determine both their futures. You consider the question seriously, not just because Lord Edmund needs an answer, but because his success or failure affects everyone in Little Wickham. If the manor collapses entirely, the village loses its legal protections, its connection to royal authority, its status as an organized community rather than just a collection of refugees camping in abandoned buildings. The solution, when it comes to you, represents everything the old world would have considered impossible. What if you stopped trying to be a lord in the old sense, you suggest, and started thinking like a merchant instead? You have land, buildings, some remaining authority. What if you used those assets to create something new rather than trying to maintain something that no longer works? The idea develops as you speak. Instead of collecting rents from tenants who can't pay them, what if Lord Edmund became a partner in their enterprises? Instead of maintaining an expensive manor house that serves no practical purpose, what if he converted parts of it into workshops or storage facilities? Instead of trying to preserve noble dignity, what if he focused on noble utility? Lord Edmund listens with the expression of a man watching his entire worldview crumble and rebuild itself in real time. The notion of a lord engaging in commerce, forming partnerships with peasants, treating his ancestral home as a business asset rather than a symbol of inherited status, would have been heretical just a few decades ago. But heresy becomes orthodoxy when orthodoxy no longer produces results. The letter from the Earl of Derby mentioned renting manor houses to merchants not as a desperate last resort, but as a sensible business decision that generated more income than traditional feudal arrangements ever could. Over the following weeks, you help Lord Edmund develop what amounts to a complete transformation of his relationship with his remaining tenants and the broader community. The Great Hall becomes a marketplace where merchants like Margaret can display goods for traveling buyers. The manor's workshops are rented to craftsmen who need space but can't afford to build their own facilities. Most revolutionary of all, Lord Edmund begins investing directly in the economic activities of his former tenants. When you need money to buy better seed for spring planting, he provides it in exchange for a share of the harvest. When Margaret wants to expand her trade connections, he offers the use of his remaining horses and carts in return for a percentage of her profits. The arrangement benefits everyone involved. Lord Edmund generates income from assets that were previously just expensive decorations. You and others gain access to resources and capital that allow you to expand your own enterprises. The village economy grows stronger rather than simply redistributing the same limited wealth among fewer people. Other lords begin visiting Little Wickham to observe this experiment in post-feudal social organization. Some come to mock what they see as Lord Edmund's degradation of his noble status. Others come to learn techniques they might apply to their own desperate circumstances. A few come to negotiate partnerships that extend the new economic model beyond the boundaries of a single manor. The most telling change comes in the way people address each other. The elaborate courtesies that once marked every interaction between social classes give way to the practical directness of business partners. You still show Lord Edmund respect, but it's the respect accorded to a competent associate rather than the fear demanded by feudal authority. Lord Edmund's transformation isn't without personal cost. Letters from other nobles express everything from disappointment to outright disgust at his abandonment of traditional aristocratic values. His own family, those members who survived the plague, struggle to understand how he can justify working alongside peasants and merchants as if they were equals. But the results speak louder than social criticism. By autumn, the manor generates more income than it has since before the plague. The village shows signs of growth rather than continued decline. New people arrive seeking opportunities in a community where social mobility has become not just possible but actively encouraged. One evening, as you and Lord Edmund review accounts that show the success of your partnership, he makes an observation that captures the magnitude of what has changed. "My grandfather would have hanged us both for this conversation," he says with something that might be relief or regret. "We're discussing profits and investments like a couple of merchants planning their next venture." "The old world died with the plague," you reply, not unkindly. "We can spend our lives mourning it, or we can build something better from what remains." Lord Edmund nods, a gesture that acknowledges not just your words but your right to speak them as an equal partner in the enterprise of survival. As you walk home through streets that show more signs of life and prosperity than they have in years, you reflect on the strange turns that history takes. A catastrophe that seemed to mark the end of civilization has instead cleared the ground for something new to grow. The desperate choices made by desperate people have created possibilities that careful planning never could have achieved. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities, new proof that the world has changed in ways that can never be unchanged. But tonight, you sleep in a house you own, in a village where your opinion matters, in a world where the accident of birth matters less than the ability to adapt, survive, and build something better from the ruins of what came before. The morning brings news that would have seemed impossible in the old world. Brother Marcus, the last surviving monk from the monastery of St. Bartholomew, stands at your door with a proposition that will change how knowledge moves through your small corner of England. His robes are patched and faded, but his eyes burn with the intensity of a man who has watched civilization's accumulated wisdom scatter like leaves in autumn wind. "I need your help, Thomas," he says without preamble. The monastery's library contains manuscripts that represent centuries of learning. Medical texts, agricultural treatises, philosophical works that exist nowhere else in England. But I'm the only one left who can read Latin, and I'm not young. When I die, all that knowledge dies with me unless we do something now. The monastery of St. Bartholomew once housed 43 monks, each trained in specific areas of knowledge that collectively preserved much of human learning through the dark centuries after Rome fell. They maintained libraries, copied manuscripts, developed new techniques in agriculture, medicine, and craftsmanship. The plague reduced their number to one elderly man trying desperately to pass on what he can before time runs out. Brother Marcus leads you through the monastery's empty halls, past cells that once housed scholars and scribes, to the library that represents one of England's great treasures. Shelves stretch from floor to ceiling, filled with books and scrolls that chronicle everything from Roman engineering techniques to Arabic mathematics, from Greek medical theories to Germanic metalworking secrets. "This manuscript," he says, pulling down a leather-bound volume, contains the complete works of Columella on agriculture. Methods for improving soil fertility, techniques for breeding better livestock, systems for managing water resources. Knowledge that could double crop yields if anyone knew how to apply it. But it's written in Latin, illustrated with diagrams that require explanation, filled with references to other works that also exist only in scholarly language. The problem extends far beyond a single monastery's library. Throughout England, specialized knowledge died with the specialists who possessed it. Master craftsmen took their trade secrets to plague graves. Physicians who understood complex treatments succumbed to the very diseases they knew how to cure. Engineers who could design bridges and buildings perished before passing their skills to the next generation. But Brother Marcus has developed a solution that represents something entirely new in how knowledge spreads through society. Instead of preserving learning within closed communities of scholars, He proposes translating essential texts into common English and teaching practical skills directly to the people who need them most. Over the following days, an unusual classroom takes shape in the monastery's scriptorium. You sit alongside Margaret, Lord Edmund, William the Silversmith, and a dozen other survivors, learning to read and write not just for the sake of literacy, but as tools for preserving and transmitting practical knowledge. Brother Marcus begins with agricultural texts, translating complex Latin treatises into simple English instructions that can be understood by working farmers. The techniques described in these ancient manuscripts prove remarkably relevant to the challenges faced by post-plague agriculture. Methods for restoring exhausted soil, systems for rotating crops to maintain fertility, procedures for breeding stronger livestock. Margaret proves particularly adept at absorbing the commercial knowledge contained in texts about trade, currency, and market organization. Manuscripts that describe Roman commercial law provide insights into contract negotiation that she immediately applies to her expanding business relationships. Greek writings on navigation help her understand the principles behind the trade routes that bring goods to her shop. The most remarkable discovery comes when Brother Marcus opens a collection of medical texts that include detailed descriptions of plague symptoms and treatment methods. The monks who wrote these manuscripts lived through earlier epidemics and developed techniques that might have saved thousands of lives if the knowledge had been more widely available. But the learning flows in both directions. Brother Marcus finds that your practical experience as a farmer reveals applications for theoretical knowledge that purely scholarly study never uncovered. His understanding of Latin agricultural texts deepens when you explain how different soil conditions affect the timing of planting seasons described in ancient Roman manuals. William's work as a silversmith provides insights into metallurgical texts that Brother Marcus had previously regarded as purely theoretical. When William demonstrates techniques his father taught him, the monk realizes that certain obscure passages in ancient manuscripts describe variations on the same fundamental processes. Word of the monastery school spreads to neighboring villages, bringing an unusual collection of students to Brother Marcus's makeshift classroom. A former knight squire arrives with questions about military engineering texts. A widow who inherited her husband's mill wants to understand manuscripts describing advanced gear systems and water management. Each new student brings practical knowledge that illuminates theoretical texts, while the ancient manuscripts provide systematic understanding that improves practical techniques. The combination creates a form of learning more comprehensive than either pure scholarship or traditional apprenticeship could achieve alone. The transformation of knowledge transmission extends beyond formal education. In the evenings, you and others gather in Margaret's shop or Lord Edmund's great hall to discuss and debate ideas encountered in the day's reading. These conversations produce insights that none of you could reach individually, combining perspectives that the old world's rigid social divisions never would have allowed to meet. Brother Marcus begins transcribing these discussions, creating new manuscripts that blend ancient wisdom with contemporary experience. His writings describe not just what Roman authors said about agriculture, but how their techniques work when applied to English soil conditions by farmers who understand both theory and practice. The project takes on greater urgency when other monasteries begin requesting copies of Brother Marcus's translations. Apparently, Saint Bartholomew is not the only religious house reduced to a single elderly scholar trying to preserve centuries of accumulated learning. The network of knowledge that once connected monasteries throughout England has collapsed, leaving isolated individuals struggling to maintain intellectual traditions that require community support. Margaret suggests applying commercial principles to the distribution of knowledge. Instead of limiting access to translated texts to religious communities, why not produce copies for anyone willing to pay for them? The income could support the translation project while making essential knowledge available to people who could put it to immediate practical use. The idea leads to another innovation that would have shocked the old world's educational establishment. Brother Marcus begins training some of his students to serve as scribes, teaching them not just to copy existing texts but to create new works that document contemporary discoveries and innovations. Your own contributions to this effort focus on agricultural techniques developed through trial and error in the years since the plague. Methods for farming with reduced labor forces, systems for managing livestock when traditional grazing patterns no longer work, procedures for maintaining soil fertility when there aren't enough workers to follow complex rotation schedules. These practical innovations, when combined with theoretical knowledge from ancient texts, produce agricultural techniques superior to anything either source could provide alone. The resulting manuscripts describe farming methods specifically adapted to post-plague conditions while grounded in centuries of accumulated wisdom about soil science, plant biology, and animal husbandry. As winter approaches, the monastery school has evolved into something unprecedented in English educational history. Knowledge flows freely between social classes, academic disciplines, theoretical study, and practical application. Students teach as well as learn, contributing insights that improve both ancient texts and contemporary techniques. Brother Marcus often pauses in his teaching to marvel at what they've created. In the old world, he observes, knowledge belonged to specialized communities that guarded their secrets jealously. Monks studied theology, knights learned warfare, peasants mastered farming, and merchants understood trade. Each group knew only what they needed for their designated role in society. But the plague broke down those barriers along with everything else. When survival depends on adapting quickly to changing circumstances, artificial restrictions on who can learn what become not just impractical but dangerous. The monastery school succeeds because it treats knowledge as a tool for solving problems rather than a marker of social status. The long-term implications extend far beyond Little Wickham and its neighboring villages. As translated texts spread to other communities and students establish similar schools elsewhere, England begins developing an educated population that combines practical skills with theoretical understanding in ways that promise to transform everything from agriculture to governance. On quiet evenings, as you practice writing by candlelight in your comfortable home, you sometimes think about the strange turns that learning has taken. A catastrophe that seemed to threaten the complete collapse of civilization has instead created opportunities for knowledge to spread more widely and develop more rapidly than ever before. The future being born in classrooms like Brother Marcus's monastery school will be populated by farmers who understand soil science, merchants who comprehend international law, craftsmen who apply engineering principles to their work, and leaders who combine practical experience with systematic learning. It's a future that would terrify the old world's guardians of specialized knowledge, but it's also a future that promises solutions to problems that specialized knowledge alone could never solve. The question of marriage arrives with spring's first warm morning, though not in any way the old world would have recognized. Margaret stands in your kitchen, not as a blushing maiden seeking a husband's protection, but as a successful businesswoman proposing a partnership that would benefit both your enterprises while creating something resembling a family in this changed world. "We're both alone," she says with characteristic directness, "and we're both succeeding in ways that would work better with cooperation than competition. Your agricultural knowledge combined with my trade connections could create opportunities neither of us could achieve separately. Plus," she adds with a smile that acknowledges the practical nature of the discussion, "it would be nice to have someone to talk to in the evenings who understands what it means to build something from nothing." The conversation takes place in your kitchen because that's where such discussions happen now, between equals rather than through intermediaries, based on mutual interest rather than family arrangements or economic necessity. Marriage in the post-plague world has become something people choose rather than something that happens to them. In the old world, marriage served primarily to transfer property between families and ensure legitimate heirs for inherited positions. Women brought dowries to marriages and received dower rights in return. Men provided economic security and legal protection. Children represented investments in family continuity rather than individuals valued for their own sake. But when half the population dies, traditional marriage patterns become not just impractical but impossible. There aren't enough appropriate matches within proper social boundaries. There aren't enough families to arrange marriages or provide dowries. There aren't enough economic positions to inherit or legal protections to transfer. What emerges instead is something unprecedented in English social history. Marriage between people who choose each other based on compatibility, shared interests, and mutual respect rather than social obligation or economic necessity. Partnerships between equals rather than contracts between families of different status. Margaret's proposal represents the new reality perfectly. She doesn't need a husband to provide economic security because she's financially independent. She doesn't need legal protection because she's learned to navigate commercial law herself. She doesn't need social respectability because her business success has created its own form of respectability. What she offers is partnership in the truest sense. Your agricultural expertise combined with her commercial knowledge could create integrated enterprises that span everything from grain production to finished goods. Your understanding of local conditions paired with her network of distant contacts could develop trade opportunities that benefit the entire region. The practical advantages become clear as you discuss the possibilities. Your crops could supply raw materials for goods Margaret sells through her expanded trade network. Her connections could provide markets for agricultural products that command higher prices than local sales ever could. Together, you could develop processing facilities that add value to farm production while creating employment for other survivors. But beyond the economic logic lies something the old world rarely permitted in marriage arrangements. Genuine affection between two people who have come to know and respect each other as individuals rather than as representatives of their social roles. You've worked together on community projects, shared meals and conversations, discovered that you enjoy each other's company and complement each other's skills. The wedding ceremony, when it takes place a month later, reflects the new world's approach to marriage and family formation. Brother Marcus performs the religious rites, but the celebration emphasizes community building rather than family honor. Lord Edmund provides the Great Hall not as a feudal obligation, but as a contribution to village morale and social cohesion. The guests include everyone who has become part of Little Wycombe's informal extended family. William the silversmith, whose craftsmanship has made him prosperous enough to consider marriage himself. The widow Alice, who now runs what used to be her husband's farming operation with greater success than he ever achieved. The young couple who arrived last autumn seeking opportunities in a community where social mobility seemed possible. The gifts presented at the wedding reflect the practical nature of post-plague marriages. Tools that will improve agricultural productivity. Account books that will help manage the expanded business operations. Household goods that emphasize comfort and efficiency rather than display. Items chosen for their utility rather than their symbolic value or social appropriateness. Brother Marcus's wedding sermon addresses the transformation of marriage itself in the years since the Great Mortality. He speaks of partnership rather than hierarchy, of mutual support rather than defined obligations, of building new forms of family based on choice and commitment rather than blood relations and inherited status. The marriage contract, written in English rather than Latin and designed to be understood by the parties rather than interpreted by lawyers, establishes joint ownership of property and equal participation in business decisions. Margaret retains control of her existing enterprises while gaining partnership rights in your agricultural operations. You acquire access to her trade networks while maintaining independence in farming decisions. Most significantly, the contract includes provisions for child-rearing that reflect the new world's approach to family formation. Children will be educated regardless of gender, trained in both practical skills and academic subjects, encouraged to develop their individual talents rather than simply inherit their parents' social positions. The changes extend beyond individual marriages to the entire structure of family life in post-plague England. Households form around economic partnerships rather than kinship relationships. Extended families include chosen members alongside blood relatives. Child rearing becomes a community responsibility rather than a purely parental obligation. Your own household, established in the larger house that Margaret's business success has made possible, includes not just the two of you but also William, who rents workshop space in your converted outbuildings, and Brother Marcus, who has moved from the empty monastery to a comfortable room where he can continue his translation work while participating in family life. The arrangement benefits everyone involved. William gains access to workshop facilities he couldn't afford independently while contributing his metalworking skills to household projects. Brother Marcus receives care and companionship in his old age while providing education and scholarly expertise. You and Margaret create a domestic environment that supports both business success and personal happiness. Children, when they begin arriving, grow up in this extended household that provides multiple role models and diverse forms of education. They learn agriculture from you, commerce from Margaret, craftsmanship from William, and academic subjects from Brother Marcus. More importantly, they learn that families can be built rather than just inherited, that relationships can be chosen rather than just accepted. The model spreads throughout Little Wycombe and beyond as other survivors discover the advantages of household arrangements based on mutual benefit rather than traditional family structures. Communities develop where single parents share child-rearing responsibilities, where elderly people contribute skills and wisdom in exchange for care and companionship, where young adults learn trades through household partnerships rather than formal apprenticeships. These new family forms prove more resilient than traditional structures in the post-plague environment. When households include multiple adults with diverse skills, the loss of any individual member doesn't threaten the entire family's survival. When children learn from several teachers rather than just their parents, education continues even if key adults die or move away. The legal system struggles to keep pace with these innovations in family structure. Traditional inheritance laws assume that property passes from fathers to eldest sons, but when households include chosen family members alongside blood relatives, such simple rules become inadequate. Courts begin recognizing new forms of legal relationship that acknowledge the reality of chosen families and partnership-based households. Women's roles transform most dramatically in this new approach to marriage and family. Margaret's success as an independent businesswoman, her equal partnership in marriage, her participation in community decision-making represent possibilities that the old world simply didn't permit. Other women throughout England discover similar opportunities as traditional restrictions lose their practical relevance. As your first child takes his first steps around a house that serves simultaneously as home, workshop, school, and business center, you reflect on how completely the plague has transformed the most basic human relationships. The catastrophe that seemed to threaten family life entirely has instead created opportunities for more diverse, more resilient, more personally fulfilling forms of human connection. The future taking shape in households like yours will be populated by people who understand that families can be chosen, that marriages can be partnerships, that children can be educated as individuals rather than simply trained for inherited roles. It's a future that would shock the old world's guardians of traditional family values, but it's also a future that promises greater happiness and success for the individuals brave enough to build it. The bell tower of Little Wycombe's parish church leans slightly to the east, a subtle but visible reminder that even God's house requires maintenance that may not come. Father Benedict, the third priest assigned to this parish since the plague, stands in the churchyard counting graves that outnumber his living parishioners by nearly 4 to 1. His face bears the particular exhaustion of a man trying to provide spiritual guidance to a community that has seen enough of God's will to question its wisdom. The morning service draws perhaps 20 souls to a church built for 200. Your voices echo strangely in the vast space, thin and fragile against stone walls that once resonated with full-throated hymns. The empty pews serve as reminders of all the voices that will never again join in praise or petition, all the souls that found whatever judgment awaits beyond this world. Father Benedict's sermon addresses the questions that everyone thinks but few dare voice aloud. Why did God permit such suffering? What purpose could justify the death of innocents? How should survivors understand their own preservation when so many worthier souls perished? His answers, honest in their uncertainty, reflect a church struggling to maintain theological coherence in the face of catastrophe that challenges every comfortable assumption about divine justice. After service, you walk with Father Benedict through the village, observing changes that represent both crisis and opportunity for organized religion. The chapel of St. Mary, once served by its own priest, stands empty because there aren't enough clergy to staff every church. But the consolidation allows Father Benedict to focus his limited energy on serving his remaining parishioners more effectively than dividing attention among multiple struggling congregations ever could. The monastery of St. Bartholomew presents a more complex case. Brother Marcus's decision to move into your household and focus on education rather than traditional monastic duties represents a practical adaptation to changed circumstances. But it also represents a fundamental shift in how religious life operates in post-plague England. We're having to reinvent everything, Father Benedict observes as you pass the monastery's empty grounds. The old system assumed that religious communities would be large enough to support themselves, that parishes would have enough members to maintain their churches, that the church hierarchy would have enough personnel to staff every position. None of those assumptions hold true anymore. The church's struggles extend far beyond Little Wycombe. Throughout England, bishops govern dioceses with too few priests to serve even half their parishes. Monasteries that once housed hundreds of monks survive with handfuls of elderly brothers. Cathedral schools that trained clergy for centuries have closed for lack of students and teachers. But the crisis has also created opportunities for religious innovation that the old system's rigid structure never would have permitted. Father Benedict, freed from oversight by bishops who are too busy managing their own crises to micromanage parish affairs, has developed approaches to ministry that emphasize practical service over theological purity. His weekly meetings in Margaret's shop, for instance, combine business discussions with informal religious counseling. When merchants face ethical dilemmas about fair pricing or honest dealing, Father Benedict provides guidance that applies Christian principles to commercial decisions. When craftsmen struggle with questions about just wages or quality workmanship, he helps them understand their trades as forms of religious vocation. This integration of spiritual guidance with everyday concerns represents something new in English religious practice. The old system maintained strict separation between sacred and secular activities, requiring people to seek religious counsel through formal channels that often seemed disconnected from practical concerns. Father Benedict's approach acknowledges that post-plague survivors need spiritual support that addresses their actual circumstances rather than idealized versions of Christian life that assume stable communities, traditional family structures, and established social hierarchies. The changes become most apparent in how the Church handles marriage, family, and social relationships. Father Benedict performs wedding ceremonies for couples whose partnerships would have violated traditional canonical rules about social equality and property arrangements. He baptizes children born into households that include chosen family members alongside blood relatives. He provides last rites for people whose living arrangements would have scandalized previous generations of clergy. These adaptations reflect not theological compromise but theological sophistication. Father Benedict understands that Christian principles must be applied to actual human situations rather than theoretical ideal conditions. His ministry succeeds because it helps people live better lives rather than simply condemning them for failing to meet impossible standards. The transformation extends to the Church's role in education and knowledge preservation. Brother Marcus's translation project receives Father Benedict's enthusiastic support because it serves the Christian mission of promoting human flourishing through the spread of useful knowledge. The monastery school's integration of religious instruction with practical education represents an innovation that could revolutionize Christian education throughout England. But the changes also create tensions with church authorities who survive from the old system. When the Bishop of Winchester visits Little Wickham to assess local conditions, he expresses concern about Father Benedict's informal approach to ministry and Brother Marcus's secular educational activities. The bishop represents traditional church thinking that emphasizes maintaining doctrinal purity and institutional authority even at the cost of reduced effectiveness in serving actual communities. His criticism of local innovations reflects the broader struggle within the church between preserving traditional forms and adapting to changed circumstances. Father Benedict's response to episcopal criticism demonstrates both respect for church hierarchy and commitment to effective ministry. He acknowledges the bishop's authority while explaining the practical necessities that have shaped his approach to parish leadership. His arguments emphasize results rather than procedures, pointing to spiritual and moral improvements in his community rather than adherence to traditional administrative requirements. The debate reveals fundamental questions about the Church's future in post-plague England. Should religious institutions focus on preserving traditional forms that may no longer serve their intended purposes, or should they adapt to changed circumstances at the risk of losing institutional continuity? Brother Marcus's perspective on these questions reflects his unique position as both traditional monk and educational innovator. The Church's mission, he argues, is to promote human salvation and flourishing rather than to maintain particular institutional forms. If traditional monasticism can't survive in post-plague conditions, then new forms of religious life must be developed that can serve the same essential purposes. His translation work represents one such innovation, spreading knowledge that improves both material and spiritual conditions for Christian communities. His educational activities create literate populations that can engage more deeply with religious texts and concepts. His integration into family life demonstrates that religious dedication can be expressed through service to particular communities rather than just abstract devotion to institutional ideals. The practical results of these innovations gradually win acceptance even from traditional church authorities. When the Bishop of Winchester returns to Little Wickham a year later, he finds a community where Christian principles are more effectively integrated into daily life than in many parishes that maintain traditional forms but lack spiritual vitality. Church attendance, while still reduced from pre-plague levels, shows signs of growth as new residents are attracted to a community where religious life supports rather than restricts individual flourishing. The quality of spiritual counsel available to parishioners exceeds what most communities receive from overworked clergy following traditional ministerial models. Most significantly, the children growing up in Little Wickham demonstrate religious knowledge and moral development that surpass what formal catechism instruction typically achieved in the old system. Brother Marcus's educational approach produces young people who understand Christian principles well enough to apply them thoughtfully to novel situations rather than simply reciting memorized responses to standard questions. As winter settles over the village, you often find yourself in conversations with Father Benedict and Brother Marcus about the future of Christian life in England. Their innovations in Little Wickham represent experiments that could be replicated throughout the country, creating a church that serves post-plague communities more effectively than traditional institutional structures ever could. The vision they describe involves religious communities organized around practical service rather than institutional maintenance, clergy who integrate spiritual guidance with worldly counsel, educational systems that combine religious instruction with useful knowledge, and church authorities who measure success by community flourishing rather than adherence to administrative procedures. It's a vision that would transform English Christianity in ways that could outlast the immediate crisis of post-plague reconstruction. The church that emerges from Little Wickham's experiments might be more flexible, more practical, more closely connected to the actual needs of Christian communities than the institution that preceded the Great Mortality. On quiet Sunday evenings, as you sit by your fire reading one of Brother Marcus's translated texts while Margaret tends to household accounts and your children play nearby, you sometimes reflect on how catastrophe has changed even humanity's relationship with the divine. The God who emerges from post-plague religious innovation seems more interested in human happiness and success than in institutional obedience and traditional forms. It's a God worth worshipping, a faith worth practicing, a church worth supporting. And perhaps that's the most important transformation of all. The journey to Winchester takes 2 days by cart, traveling roads that show clear signs of the transformation spreading throughout England. Villages that once cowered behind defensive walls now sprawl confidently into former wilderness areas. Markets that used to operate only on designated days now function continuously, their expanded activities spilling from traditional squares into converted buildings and new construction designed specifically for commerce. Margaret sits beside you on the cart seat, her ledgers carefully wrapped against road dust, her mind focused on business opportunities that the old world never would have permitted. This trip represents the expansion of her trading network from local and regional sales to direct participation in the commercial activities of England's second-largest city. Winchester's walls appear through morning mist like the outline of another world. Before the plague, these stone fortifications enclosed a city of nearly 20,000 souls engaged in activities so specialized that rural people like you could barely comprehend their complexity. Guilds controlled every aspect of commercial life, from the quality of bread sold in bakeries to the wages paid to construction workers. Now those same walls enclose perhaps 8,000 residents, but their reduced numbers have created opportunities for innovation and growth that the old system's rigid controls never would have allowed. The gates that once strictly regulated who could enter the city and what goods they could bring now stand open to anyone willing to contribute to urban prosperity. The transformation becomes apparent as soon as you enter the city proper. Buildings that once housed single-purpose guild operations now serve multiple functions under the control of entrepreneurs who combine traditional crafts in ways that create entirely new products and services. A former blacksmith shop produces not just iron tools but finished goods that incorporate metalwork, woodworking, and textile elements into items no guild system ever would have permitted. Margaret leads you through streets that reveal the mathematics of urban transformation. When half the population dies, the survivors inherit not just the buildings and equipment of the deceased, but also their customers, their supplier relationships, their positions in commercial networks that once seemed impermeable to outsiders. The Wool Guild's Great Hall now serves as a general marketplace where anyone can rent space to display goods for sale. The restrictions that once limited wool trading to guild members have become impossible to enforce when there aren't enough surviving guild members to control the market. Margaret pays a small fee for table space and begins unpacking goods that represent the integration of rural production with urban distribution networks. Her textiles, produced by cottage workers in villages throughout the region, compete directly with products from established urban workshops. But instead of undercutting established producers on price alone, Margaret offers innovations that combine rural materials with urban finishing techniques to create goods that neither pure rural nor pure urban production could achieve. The customers who examine Margaret's offerings represent another aspect of urban transformation. Merchants who once specialized in particular types of goods now deal in whatever proves profitable. Craftsmen who learned single trades have diversified into multiple skills. Consumers who once bought only locally produced items now seek goods from throughout England and beyond. William, who accompanied you on this trip to learn about urban markets for his silver work, discovers opportunities that exceed his most optimistic expectations. The guild system that once would have required years of apprenticeship and substantial fees for admission to urban crafts has collapsed. Skill and quality matter more than credentials and connections. A wealthy merchant examines William's work with the eye of someone who understands both craftsmanship and commercial potential. "This is excellent work," he observes, testing the weight and balance of a silver cup. "Where did you serve your apprenticeship?" When William explains his unconventional training, the merchant nods approvingly. These days, results matter more than pedigree. Would you be interested in producing goods specifically for the London market? The conversation that follows would have been impossible under the old guild system. William, a rural craftsman with informal training, negotiates directly with a major urban merchant to supply goods for England's most sophisticated market. No guild membership, no formal credentials, no family connections required. Just skill, quality, and the ability to meet commercial requirements. The transformation extends beyond individual commercial relationships to the entire structure of urban governance. The mayor of Winchester, elected from among the surviving merchant community, operates with practical authority that the old system's complex hierarchies never achieved. When decisions need to be made about market regulations, tax assessments, or infrastructure maintenance, they can be implemented quickly rather than debated through layers of competing jurisdictions. This streamlined governance proves especially important for managing the rapid changes occurring throughout the urban economy. New types of businesses require new forms of regulation. International traders bring legal questions that local courts never faced before. Population movements create housing and sanitation challenges that traditional administrative structures weren't designed to handle. The mayor's solutions emphasize practical effectiveness over institutional precedent. When Margaret requests permission to establish a permanent warehouse for goods awaiting shipment to distant markets, he grants it based on the economic benefits to the city rather than adherence to traditional restrictions on rural merchants operating in urban areas. Your own role in these urban innovations develops unexpectedly when Brother Marcus's translated agricultural texts attract attention from city officials concerned about food security. Urban populations depend on reliable grain supplies from rural areas, but the old system of feudal obligations and traditional farming methods no longer guarantees adequate production. The Mayor's Council invites you to consult on agricultural policies that could improve food production in the regions surrounding Winchester. Your expertise, developed through practical farming experience enhanced by scholarly study, provides insights that neither pure theorists nor traditional practitioners could offer. The consulting work reveals another aspect of post-plague social transformation. Knowledge and expertise have become valuable commodities that can be sold across traditional social boundaries. You, a rural peasant, provide advice to urban authorities because your knowledge produces results, not because of your social status or institutional credentials. The integration of rural and urban economies creates opportunities that benefit both communities. Winchester's surviving craftsmen gain access to raw materials and finished goods from rural producers like Margaret. Rural communities gain access to urban markets, urban capital, and urban expertise that can improve their own production capabilities. Most significantly, the artificial barriers between rural and urban populations begin to dissolve. Young people from farming families can pursue urban careers without formal apprenticeships or family connections. Urban craftsmen can establish operations in rural areas where costs are lower and regulations less restrictive. Knowledge, skills, and capital flow freely between communities that were once rigidly separated. The Winchester Cathedral provides a striking example of how institutions adapt to urban transformation. With reduced congregations and diminished income from traditional sources, the cathedral has begun renting space to commercial activities that support both the religious community and the broader urban economy. The Cathedral School, once reserved for training clergy, now offers education to merchant families willing to pay fees that help support the religious institution. The curriculum combines traditional religious instruction with practical subjects like mathematics, accounting, and commercial law that prepare students for success in the transformed urban economy. As your visit to Winchester draws to a close, you spend an evening in a tavern that illustrates the social changes accompanying economic transformation. The customers include rural merchants like Margaret, urban craftsmen, traveling traders, religious figures, and even former nobles who have adapted to changed circumstances by entering commercial activities. The conversations around shared tables reveal how completely the plague has transformed English society. People discuss business partnerships that cross traditional social boundaries, educational opportunities that ignore conventional restrictions, political developments that reflect practical necessities rather than inherited privileges. The tavern keeper, a woman who inherited the establishment from her deceased husband and expanded it into one of Winchester's most successful businesses, represents the entrepreneurial spirit driving urban transformation. She provides not just food and drink but also informal banking services, message delivery, temporary storage for traveling merchants, and meeting space for business negotiations. Her success demonstrates how urban economics have evolved beyond the old system's rigid categorizations. Instead of single-purpose businesses operating under guild restrictions, the new urban economy rewards entrepreneurs who identify opportunities and develop innovative solutions regardless of traditional boundaries. The return journey to Little Wickham provides time to reflect on the implications of what you've observed in Winchester. The urban revolution isn't just changing cities, it's creating new relationships between urban and rural communities that promise to transform all of English society. Margaret's success in establishing urban market connections represents just the beginning of integration processes that could reshape England's entire economic structure. When rural producers can sell directly to urban consumers, when urban expertise can be applied to rural challenges, when people can move freely between rural and urban careers, the artificial divisions that once defined English society begin to lose their practical relevance. The future taking shape in cities like Winchester will be characterized by mobility, innovation, and integration rather than the stability, tradition, and separation that defined the pre-plague world. It's a future that promises greater opportunities for individual success but also requires greater adaptability and entrepreneurial skill. As Little Wickham's familiar buildings come into view, you realize that your village no longer seems isolated from the broader currents of English life. The connections established through this trip to Winchester represent just one strand in a network of relationships that increasingly bind rural and urban communities into a single, dynamic economic system. It's a system that rewards innovation, punishes rigidity, and creates opportunities for anyone clever enough and determined enough to seize them. The urban revolution isn't just changing cities, it's creating a new world where the accidents of birth matter less than the ability to adapt, learn, and build something better from the opportunities that catastrophe has created. 20 years have passed since your first confrontation with the Royal Commissioners, and the world they tried to preserve exists now only in memory and in the complaints of old people who remember when everyone knew their place. You stand in the great hall of what was once Lord Edmund's Manor House, now the headquarters of the Little Wickham Trading Company, watching your eldest son review shipping manifests for goods destined for markets in London, Flanders, and the German principalities. The transformation is complete, though it happened so gradually that no single moment marked the transition from the old world to the new. The feudal system simply faded away like morning mist, replaced by relationships based on contract, merit, and mutual benefit rather than birth, tradition, and inherited obligation. Your son Thomas, named for you but destined for opportunities you never could have imagined, speaks 3 languages fluently and understands commercial law well enough to negotiate contracts with Italian bankers. His education, provided by brother Marcus and continued in Winchester and London, prepared him for a world where knowledge and adaptability matter more than social pedigree. Margaret enters the hall carrying correspondence from trading partners throughout Europe. At 55, she has become one of England's most successful merchants, her network extending from Scotland to the Mediterranean. But more than commercial success, she represents the transformation of women's roles in English society. Her advice is sought by nobles, her business partnerships are courted by foreign traders, her opinions influence policy discussions in Winchester and London. The letter she carries brings news that would have seemed impossible in the old world. The King of England has issued a proclamation officially recognizing the new economic realities that emerged from the plague's aftermath. The Statute of Laboris, that desperate attempt to restore pre-plague social relationships, has been formally repealed. Workers are now free to seek employment wherever they choose, at wages determined by market forces rather than royal decree. But the proclamation represents more than just official recognition of existing realities. It acknowledges that England's prosperity depends on the innovations and adaptations that survivors like you developed in response to catastrophic change. The rigid social hierarchies that once defined English civilization have been replaced by more flexible arrangements that reward competence over conformity. Lord Edmund, now approaching 70, serves as the company's senior partner in governmental relations, his title and remaining connections useful for navigating the complex negotiations required for international trade. His transformation from feudal lord to business executive represents the broader adaptation of England's traditional ruling class to changed circumstances. Some nobles chose different paths. The correspondence from London includes news of former lords who abandoned their English estates entirely, seeking fortunes as mercenaries in foreign wars or settling in distant lands where traditional hierarchies still function. Others attempted to maintain feudal relationships through force, only to find themselves isolated and eventually bankrupt as their former subjects simply walked away to seek better opportunities elsewhere. But the most successful members of the old nobility followed Lord Edmund's example, adapting their skills and resources to serve new economic functions while maintaining enough traditional authority to provide stability during the transition period. Their success demonstrates that social transformation need not destroy all existing institutions, only those that serve no useful purpose in changed circumstances. William, now master craftsman in his own right, oversees workshops that combine traditional English metalworking with techniques learned from foreign artisans attracted to Little Wycombe's growing reputation as a center for innovation and opportunity. His apprentices include not just local young people but also refugees from continental wars, former nobles' sons seeking practical skills, and daughters of merchant families preparing for commercial careers. The integration of diverse knowledge and techniques has produced craftsmanship that surpasses what the old guild system ever achieved. When innovation is rewarded rather than restricted, when techniques can be shared rather than hoarded, when apprentices are selected for ability rather than family connections, the quality and creativity of human work improve dramatically. Brother Marcus, though now quite elderly, continues his educational work with the energy of someone who understands the historical significance of what is helping to create. His translated texts have spread throughout England and beyond, carrying practical knowledge that improves everything from agricultural productivity to medical treatment. But his greatest achievement may be the educational model developed in Little Wycombe and now replicated in communities throughout England. Schools that combine religious instruction with practical training, academic study with real-world application, theoretical knowledge with experiential learning, produce graduates equipped for success in a rapidly changing world. The children educated in these schools represent England's future in the most literal sense. They understand both traditional learning and contemporary innovation. They can navigate both local communities and international markets. They possess both practical skills and theoretical knowledge. Most importantly, they approach problems with confidence that solutions can be found through intelligence and effort rather than acceptance of existing limitations. Your daughter Mary exemplifies this new generation's potential. At 22, she manages the company's financial operations with sophistication that would impress London bankers. Her marriage to a physician trained in both classical medical texts and contemporary surgical techniques represents the kind of partnership that combines traditional knowledge with innovative practice. Their children, your grandchildren, grow up in a world where opportunity depends on ability rather than inheritance, where social mobility is normal rather than exceptional, where innovation is expected rather than discouraged. They speak of traveling to the new world being discovered beyond the Western Ocean, of establishing trading posts in lands their grandparents never knew existed. The transformation extends far beyond Little Wycombe to encompass all of English society. London has become Europe's most dynamic commercial centre, its growth fueled by the entrepreneurial energy unleashed when traditional restrictions collapsed along with the social system that imposed them. Parliament increasingly represents merchant interests rather than just noble privileges, its legislation focused on facilitating trade rather than preserving feudal relationships. The English Church has evolved into an institution that serves community needs rather than just institutional requirements. Parish priests like Father Benedict provide practical guidance for daily life while maintaining spiritual authority. Monasteries have become centers of learning and innovation rather than just religious retreat. Cathedral schools prepare students for commercial and governmental careers while preserving theological scholarship. But perhaps the most significant transformation is cultural rather than institutional. The English people have developed confidence in their ability to adapt, innovate, and improve their circumstances through intelligence and effort. The catastrophic mortality that once seemed to threaten civilization's complete collapse has instead demonstrated humanity's remarkable capacity for creative response to seemingly impossible challenges. This confidence expresses itself in everything from architectural projects that surpass pre-plague construction in both beauty and functionality, to artistic works that combine traditional forms with contemporary innovations, to literary productions that document the transformation while imagining even greater possibilities for human achievement.